Thank you, Dr. Navon, for that very insightful with regard to the diplomatic history of Israel. When I started looking at the book, I was really puzzled, particularly the first two chapters. I have read quite a bit of Israeli foreign policy, but as Professor also mentioned during his introductory remarks, most of them have been pertinent, to some particular geographical location, and not really giving the in-depth analysis with regard to the diplomatic history. But by dividing the book into four parts and into 21 sections, you have done a marvelous job in bringing out some of the most fascinating aspects of the Israeli foreign policy.
Thank you.
Just to start off the discussion, you also have spoken in length about the diplomatic history during the pre-state period of Israel. I would like to know, so as a kind of very personal question, that what was the motivating factor behind, devoting a solid two chapters on the, pre-state, diplomatic history of Israel, which I find is very unique for a scholar to have done while writing on aspects pertaining to Israeli foreign policy. The motivation behind writing those aspects of the Israeli diplomatic history.
Well, the motivation was really to, in my view, to provide a historical perspective. Because I think it's impossible to understand the way Israel conducts itself on the world scene today, and the way the Jews in general perceive themselves vis-a-vis other nations, without having this wide historical perspective of where it comes from. So my purpose, really, my motivation was to provide a historical perspective, and of course, this perspective itself is subject to debate, because I quote, actually, I mentioned in the introduction the expression that had been used by the British historian Arnold Toynbee on the Jews and the Jewish people. Toynbee claimed that the Jews were a fossil. In other words, that what you see today, people who claim to call themselves Jews, Toynbee claimed that they were actually a fossil, that they were kind of a remain from ancient history, but they were not that same people. And that was a very controversial statement, of course, to say the Jews of today are not the Jews of 2,000 years ago. They're a fossil. It's just like what you see in a museum. It's not real. And he was debated by an Israeli diplomat and scholar, Jacob Herzog, at McGill University in 1961 about this expression. And at some point, Herzog said, but well, look at the Jews today. I mean, look at the state of Israel. The Hebrew language, obviously, they came back to life. And so Toynbee even admitted himself that he said, well, okay, I'll admit that you can revive a fossil just like you can defrost a car. And that's really what the debate is about, whether or not, the Jews, of course, have gone through many changes in terms of language, in terms of behavior, etc., etc. But if you look at it as one same people along this long history, then you need to provide this historical perspective. And as I said, the history of the Jewish people does not start in 1948, which is precisely why, in my opinion, it was important to provide this wide historical perspective.
Thank you, sir. Now I open the floor to the audience. May I request Professor Kechichian to give his insights or any questions to Professor Navon? Sir.
Thank you, Alvin. I appreciate it. And thank you for the presentation, Professor Navon. Very eloquently presented 3,000 years of history. Now, as I'm sure you know, I am an American from Armenian origin, and I was interested in your last remarks about the fact that after 1948, Israel decided to have good diplomatic relations with non-Arab powers in the region, Iran in particular, but also Turkey. And now you said that in 2020, Israel is facing a tremendous challenge from Turkey. Now, of course, I was very much surprised and happily surprised by the fact that you concentrated on the fact that the latest reconciliation, to put it that way, between the Abrahamic peoples are between Jews in Israel and Sunni Arabs in the Gulf. But Azerbaijan is a Shia state. And today, one of the mysteries of 2020 is Israel's behavior with Azerbaijan against Armenia, which is not only shocking, but contradictory. Maybe you can elaborate some more on the motivations as to why this choice was made and whether that truly serves the long-term interests of Israel. Thank you.
So thank you for your question. It's a very good point, and I think it touches right to the issue of realpolitik and how far you should go with realpolitik in foreign policy. I think very clearly regarding Israel's relation with Azerbaijan, especially in the recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, this is definitely a case of realpolitik pushed to its limits. And by the way, there were other instances in Israel's diplomatic history, especially when Israel was isolated internationally in the 1970s and 1980s, especially after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when nearly all African states severed their relation with Israel, and after Israel did not have relation either with the communist bloc, with the Soviet bloc, so Israel was very, very isolated, and its foreign policy at the time was mostly about, let's say, arms sales to militaristic regimes in Latin America, which was morally reprehensible. Also, Israel's close relation with South Africa after most African countries cut their diplomatic relation with Israel. These were typically cases of realpolitik pushed to its limits. In foreign policy, you always have this tension between values and interest, realpolitik and principles. And this comes back to us today in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, because the reason why Israel has this relation with Azerbaijan today is because it's kind of a win-win relation where Azerbaijan is a major provider of oil to Israel, and Israel is a major provider of military technology to Azerbaijan. Why Azerbaijan? Because Azerbaijan, even though it is a Sunni country, is also a secular Sunni country, which is very anti-Iran. And Israel has this special relationship with Azerbaijan as part of its policy against Iran. There were actually rumors in the past that there was even an Israeli military presence and air bases in Azerbaijan. But in any case, it is true. I completely understand why Armenians are shocked by the way Israel is basically providing military technology and equipment to Azerbaijan. It is very clearly a case of realpolitik in which the historical relation between Israel and Armenia has been sacrificed. I definitely recognize that there's a serious moral problem here, it's a typical case, as I said, of realpolitik versus values. It is very hard, I must say, for me to see Israel supplying Azerbaijan with all this technology in the war against Armenia, where we know the history of the Armenian people and of the Jewish people. And I completely understand the anger and frustration of the Armenians in that case. But I think it's also very clearly here a case of choosing realpolitik. Whether or not it's justified, it's a matter of debate. It's also a matter, by the way, of and this has to do mostly maybe with Israeli handling its public diplomacy I think Israel should have said something more clearly regarding Armenia, and we didn't do that. That's, I think, was a mistake. There was room, I think, for handling this differently. But I hear the criticism, and I understand it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor. May I request Ambassador Sanjay Singh, sir, who earlier served as Indian ambassador to Iran, to raise any comments or any questions, sir?
Professor Nevon, that was a fascinating talk,
Thank you.
fascinating. And I think it whets our appetite to get hold of your book and go through it. But curiosity could not stop me because you are an expert. And therefore, I wanted to ask you, is there any evidence of there being an embassy from Sheba to the court of King Solomon, firstly? But more importantly, when Israel existed as a state, the ancient Israel existed as a state, I've read that it had always, and it did well, whenever it had a powerful ally in the region. Now, does this apply anymore? Because you have mentioned that in the 60s, you had very strong relations, Israel had very strong relations with Turkey and Iran, Shah's Iran, in contradiction to the Arab powers. Now, this situation is now changing, but with a very strong ally in United States. Does this historical precedent still apply that Israel needs to have a strong ally in the region?
So I think the two questions are related because the alliance of the periphery that we had in the 60s included Ethiopia, and the reason why it included Ethiopia is because the Emperor Haile Selassie considered himself a descendant from King Solomon, and in fact his dynasty was called the Solomonic dynasty. And on the symbols on his seal there was a Lion of Judah and a Star of David, and so he definitely considered himself part of that history. And by the way, even in modern times, even before Israel became independent, the ties between the Jewish population of British Palestine and the emperor were strengthened, as I explain in my book, when Mussolini decided to invade Abyssinia in 1935. There were of course, British troops that fought against Mussolini and helped the emperor. And among those troops, I mean, one of the officers who fought in Ethiopia against the Italians was Orde Wingate, who was a Zionist Christian British officer, and he brought. I mean, some soldiers, Jewish soldiers, they were called at the time Palestinian Jewish soldiers, right? Soldiers from the underground military forces in British Palestine went with Orde Wingate in Ethiopia to fight the Italians and help him. And in fact, when he left his country after the Italian invasion, he stopped in Jerusalem for a pilgrimage before he went to England. So you can see that this link, whether or not there was at the time, of course, we cannot know for sure what was at the time in ancient times in terms of embassies and ties, etc. But in modern times, we know and we see that at the time of Haile Selassie, he definitely considered himself part of this history. And as I said, even in the war against Mussolini in 1935, Jewish soldiers from British Palestine helped him fight the Italians. Now, when it comes to the alliances today, I mean, first of all, it's also something that I show in the book, that even in ancient times, in the ancient Jewish kingdoms in antiquity, you did have alliances, whether it was with Egypt or Assyria when necessary. And what I even show, by the way, in the book, when I look at one of the book of the Bible in Ezra and Nehemiah, when the emperor of Persia, Cyrus, allows the Jews to rebuild their temple and to rebuild the country. And when you look how the book of Nehemiah describes the tension between the Jews who come back from Persia and who face the opposition of the new locals who oppose the reestablishment of an independent Jewish kingdom, even though there is a public statement from the biggest empire at the time of Persia, you have this local politics on the ground with populations saying to the king, don't let them rebuild. And then they fight about the meaning of the Edict of Cyrus. And when you read at those fights, those diplomatic infights at the time, it just looks almost exactly like what you had in the 30s between the British Empire and the Zionist movement, with the Zionists saying, hey, we have your Balfour Declaration. You said it was okay for us to rebuild. And the British say, no, actually, we changed our mind. And the Arabs don't want it. I mean, it just, it's amazing to see the parallels between those two situations. But in terms of allies today, I think it's very clear as far as Israel is concerned that the strategic alliance with the United States is something that has become very central in Israel foreign policy and national interest, which, by the way, raises a question which I also deal with in my book of our relations today with China, because in recent years Israel has been able to build a very strong relation with China in terms of investments, in terms of economic ties. Israel happens to be, if you look at all the maps of the BRI, of the Belt and Road Initiative, Israel is on the map of the BRI in terms of Chinese investments in Israeli infrastructures and technology. And now today you have the Americans telling us you have to stop that. You really have to stop with the Chinese, and that really creates a dilemma for Israel because, in the past, in 2000, for example, Israel had to cancel a military agreement with China under American pressures, and it caused us a lot of trouble with the Chinese. And today, again, we have to face this dilemma. And I think in terms of, if you ask me about, Israel's international alliances, I think one of the key challenges of Israel's foreign policy in the coming years, and even in the coming months, is going to handle this very complicated relation that we have with China and the United States. We're really part of this, I would say, of this geopolitical contest and tension between the US and China.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Navon. May I request Dr. Mudassir to raise his comments or queries?
Thank you, Dr. Navon. I think I would echo the previous comments that it was a fascinating, discussion, and it certainly has raised the curiosity, many of us, most of us actually, to go through and read the book. There are two things which really struck me during the presentation. One is the wide canvas you have taken, and I think now I understand the, with your explanation and all, the rationality behind this. But one question regarding that: how has this been taken among the Israeli academia, the larger academia? How has the book and the discussion in the book been taken by them? The second thing which really fascinated me is your hypothesis about the need for a balance between realism and idealism in the conduct of foreign policy, in the conduct of diplomacy. And I think you also said that you take the inspiration from the fact that nations have to find a balance, the philosophical balance between spirituality and perhaps materialism. So let me be a bit kind of provocative here and ask you a question as to how do you assess the current situation in terms of Israeli conduct of diplomacy and your hypothesis about finding a balance between realism and idealism. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, regarding the first question, the book came out really recently in November. So, it's been reviewed by scholars. It will take time until we have, reviews and articles, but it's just the beginning. In terms of Israel, the book actually is also being translated into Hebrew and is scheduled to be published sometime in 2021. And I think as far as Israeli Academy is concerned, probably we'll get more feedback also once the book is published into Hebrew. But it really came out a month and a half ago, so you have to give time to people to read it and write reviews. So and we'll maybe we can meet again in a few months, and I'll give you some more feedback regarding the second question. I think that in the case of Israel, one of the we spoke before on the issue of Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think that my take on that is that definitely maybe in recent years there has been a lot of realpolitik and maybe very little values in Israel's foreign policy in recent years. I think, for example, and I bring up this issue also in my book. I mean, my criticism, at least, on how Israel's foreign policy has been handled in recent years, is that I think that it's in a way it's okay to go for realpolitik all the way when you're weak, when you don't have a choice. Think about Israel in the 70s and the 80s doing business with South Africa and Latin America because we were isolated. But today Israel is a major power, and therefore I think that there's no need, as unfortunately the Prime Minister has done recently, to go out of his way with those photo ops with Bolsonaro and Orban. We don't need that. I can understand the strategy of fostering strong ties with conservative governments in South America because they're fighting Hezbollah and Iran influence in South America. It doesn't mean that you have to hug Bolsonaro in front of the cameras. You can just do it discreetly. Same thing with Europe. I understand the strategy of divide and rule in the European Union in order to block decisions from the Council of Ministers, the one they wanted to pass a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, condemning the US decision to transfer the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So that's fine, obviously, to use our special ties with countries in Eastern Europe to block those decisions. But again, doesn't mean that you have to go hug Orban in front of the cameras, because I think that's a problematic aspect of that. I think Israel is powerful enough today to be able to afford not to overdo it with the realpolitik. I think maybe to answer your question, this balance has been kind of broken in recent years, for sure. I think there's room to say that.
Thank you, Mudassir. Thank you, Professor. Do we have any other audience who would like to pose a question to Dr. Navon?
Alba, if I may come in again, and
sure,
this place. Professor, let me ask you, this is completely provocative. Has Israel been able to factor in the second coming into its diplomatic and foreign policy?
The what again? Sorry?
The second coming of the Messiah.
Well, this is more I would say, a theological question, of course. But as you know, the evangelists claim that the Messiah already came with Jesus, and that he's going to come again. So that's the debate between the Jews and the evangelicals. And the former mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, the mythical mayor who was mayor of Jerusalem for many, many years, whenever he was asked about this by evangelicals, he said to the evangelicals, he said, you know what? When the Messiah comes again in Jerusalem, I'll ask him a very simple question, and he will answer. He will determine who's right between Jews and the evangelicals. We'll ask him, sir, is it your first time in town? And so, according to his answer, we'll be able to know.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Navon. May I request Rohit to ask this question to Dr. Navon? Rohit, please.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for your insightful presentation. So I have a question that is, sir, do you see any evidence of any individual leaders' personality traits over diplomacy, on diplomacy? So for example in case, had it been some other leader than Ben Gurion, would that have any different outcome in 1948? So do you think personality traits matter in diplomacy?
I think so. I think that personality definitely plays a very important role. There are many examples in history, not only in the history of Israel, of course, but of personalities that were there at the right time, at the right moment. The history of many countries, whether it's Gandhi in India, De Gaulle in France, or Churchill in England, having those very strong personalities at that time, at that very moment, plays a very important role. And I think that Ben Gurion was such a figure. And of course, it's, we can always speculate about what would happen, what would have happened if another person had been there at the time. But I think that very clearly the personality of certain leaders at certain times plays a very important role. By the way, even in the case, I mean, I show this in my book also, in the case of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, his personal, the personal advisor of Franklin Roosevelt said that if David Niles, he said, and I read this in my chapter in the US, he said that if FDR had been president of the United States in 1947 and 1948, and don't forget that he died early, I mean, he died of illness in 1945. So Niles said if Roosevelt had been president then, Israel would never have been independent, because he was completely opposed to partition and to recognizing Israel. President Truman made the decision that he made against the will of the State Department and the establishment in Washington. And this goes to show that, yes, leaders and personality can play a very important role in diplomacy, and of course, not only in the case of Israel.
Thank you, sir. May I request Kumaraswamy sir to...
I'm a little provoked by your argument that now that Israel is very strong, and probably Israel should be more assertive rather than largely driven by real politics. And my question is that does it mean that Armenian question was always been bothering Israel? And Israel was not able to identify the Armenian massacre historically because of compulsions of Turkey. Now that Israel is more welcomed in the region, do you expect a shift in Israeli policy towards the Armenian question?
Well, first of all, I hope so. And by the way, the reason why Israel was not among the countries that recognized the Armenian genocide at the time was because of our special relationship with Turkey. That relationship basically ended about 15 years ago, even a bit more depending on how you look at Erdogan's policy. But until Erdogan, as Israel and Turkey had this special relation, one of the reasons why the Turks were fostering and developing this relation with Israel was to use the Israeli lobby in Washington, AIPAC, to block the recognition of the Armenian genocide by Congress. And you'll notice that Congress eventually recognized, basically the AIPAC stopped lobbying Congress on that when a relation with Turkey ended. So this is very clearly a case also of realpolitik. I think that the only way to expect a change in Israel's approach to the Armenian question, but also, as I said, our approach to populist leaders in Eastern Europe and South America, it's only going to happen with a change of leadership in Israel. I'm working very hard on that. I'll tell you what happens on March 23.
That's good. Okay. That's good. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Do we have anybody in the room who would like to ask a question? So if we have time, can I ask a question, sir? Professor Dr. Nevon, your section 16 of part 4, the long march to Asia. Given the diplomatic history between Israel and some of the Asian countries, there seems to be a lack of political relationship between some of the ASEAN countries. It's like only in the recent times the relationship has come out in the forefront, and they have started to engage basically on the military security issues and a little bit of economic dimension as well. Why do you think there is this lack of political ties between the two sides, given the long standing relations between countries like Thailand, Philippines, Myanmar during the 50s and the 60s?
So, I mean, obviously, Asia is such a big continent with so many different countries, but it's true that in many cases, the relationship started as a military relation, especially in the case of Singapore, for example. And by the way, with China also, I show in my book that originally the behind the scene and secret relation that Israel started forming with China in the late 1970s started also via military ties. But today, of course, the ties are not only military, but also economic. In the case of China, by the way, Israel in 2004 was basically asked by the United States to end all military relations with China, and today it's only economic and business-wise. It's not military. But Israel is still doesn't have. I mean, it has diplomatic relations with nearly all countries in Asia, except today still for Malaysia and Indonesia, and of course North Korea, as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan. But actually, after this conference, my next task for today is that I was asked. I had to write an article because I was approached by some kind of a think tank or a website I've never heard about from Pakistan, and they asked me to write an article for them, asking me if I think that that Pakistan should establish relations with Israel. So you see, there's obviously something happening there. It's very interesting. That's my next project for the day, is to write this article for a think tank in Pakistan, asking me if I think there should be relations between the two countries. So you see, life is interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Navon. Any last question anybody would like to raise? Or
Okay.
All right, sir. Dr. Navon, it's been a very fascinating evening that we have with you, covering the entire gamut of the book. And I'm sure that this is going to be a very significant contribution to the researchers who are dealing with Israeli foreign policy, particularly the pre-state insights that you have given in the book. I look forward to reading again and again this book, and also reviewing the book for the journal. And with these few words, I now hand over the floor to Sir.
Thank you.